In this presentation, we will be discussing the connections between two novels we have read this semester. The Life and Adventures of Joaquin Murrieta, the celebrated California bandit, written by Native American John Rollin Ridge, and The Female American, written by an anonymous writer under the pseudonym Unca Eliza Wingfield. The Life and Adventures of Joaquin Murrieta was published sometime in 1854. This date is significant not only in demonstrating the real-life account of a famous bandit, but in the cultural history of America's West Coast. Much like today, there was strife between the United States and Mexico, as both fought for land they believed belonged to them, and what these borders meant for each country. America was not only interested in the land inhabited by the Mexican people, but also by the fact that Mexico had abolished slavery in 1829, something the United States would not achieve until 1865. This led to the Mexican-American War, which lasted from 1846 to 1848 and had countless battles with many lives lost. The war would end with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed on February 2, 1948. In this treaty, Mexico signed over Texas, Arizona, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and most importantly, California. This treaty was signed just 8 days after the California gold rush officially began. However, the news of gold didn't reach other Americans until February 2nd, the same day the treaty was signed. Not only was there tension from the war that had just ended, but Mexico also felt betrayed for losing this discovery of gold and prosperity for the nation.
In The Female American, Unca struggles with her own identity as a person of mixed British and Native American ancestry. These two cultures were at odds with each other in the New World, such as when the French and Native peoples joined together to fight Britain in what is now called the 7 Years' War, which raged from 1754 to 1763. With the fledgling British colonies in America beginning to search for more self-determination, Britain moved to control all relations with Native Americans. By the Royal Proclamation of 1763, a line was drawn down the Appalachian Mountains, marking the limit of settlement from the British colonies. Beyond this line, Indian trade was to be conducted strictly through the British-appointed commissioners. Many colonists saw this proclamation as a loss of power to control their own fortunes, causing even greater strife between the colonists and Britain. The British government's huge underestimation of how deeply the Halton westward expansion would be resented by the colonists was one of the major factors in sparking the 12-year crisis that led to the American Revolution. Even though both of these novels are years apart, they share a common similarity of the struggle of race in early American history. Now let's get to the similar themes these novels share. The first similarity we see is the justification of race. Writing about people of color during this time was not popular among Americans nor the British alike. The narratives were often not heard or valued at all, so when writing these novels, the writers had to justify why the reader should care about a race that was often despised by Americans. Ridge makes this justification by presenting that Joaquin once did not identify as Mexican. In the beginning of the novel, Murrieta feels a disassociation with the Mexican community. He feels disgusted with the conduct of his degenerate countrymen and fired with enthusiastic admiration of the American character. Murrieta is dissatisfied with the country he was born in, and especially with the people around him. This leads him to America in search of a place that he thinks will better reflect his values and character. However, very early into this journey, he discovers that many Americans failed to support the honor and dignity of that title, as they raped his lover and cast him off because of his race.
The next justification of race we see is in Unca's narrative when she talks about the native side of her family. She discusses in depth how her mother was an Indian princess and that she comes from a romanticized version of Native American culture. The audience's interest in Unca is justified through her education. She says, "I was continued here till I was 18 years of age, during which time I made a great progress in the Greek and Latin languages and other polite literature, whilst my good aunt took care of the female part of my education with equal sense. Here we are supposed to see why we should value this character, as she is educated and now perceived as worth something. She also goes on to say, "For though I was pleased with my situation and the affection treatment of my relations, yet I secretly longed to see my native country, of which I relate a perfect idea, but more to see my father." Here she is talking about Britain, and we are also supposed to see that she identifies more as British than she does native, making a white audience like her more. It is both of these instances of justification that set up how we will view these characters throughout their narratives. The next theme these novels share is the idea of rejecting assimilation. Assimilation is the idea that a minority group eventually adapts to the customs and attitudes of the nation they live in. Joaquin Murrieta does this by first presenting himself as wanting to be fully American, something we discussed in the earlier quote. However, when his lover is killed, he decides to take whatever he can from the American people, choosing not to assimilate into their culture, but to become a bandit instead. When he is talking to his American friend about his decisions, he goes on to say, "I am not the man I once was. I am a deep-dyed scoundrel, but so help me God, I was driven to it by the oppression and wrong." After the rape of his lover, it seems that Murrieta hates all Americans. However, he lets his friend live even in the presence of other Mexicans, because his true identity was more important than his sense of belonging. Although he did warn him of betrayal, thus proving his desire for revenge to be greater than any other feeling.
We see the same idea in The Female American, when Unka refuses to assimilate into the native culture. She instead clings to her British identity and forces the natives to convert to Christianity and follow her. The question of assimilation is an idea that even modern immigrants face today, as they face the pressure to fully assimilate oneself into another culture while also keeping one's cultural identity. We see this when Unka is struggling to decide whether she should hide from the natives or join them, as she says, "I thought the extraordinariness of the event, my speaking to them, would appear miraculous, fill them with awe, and prejudice their minds greatly in favor of what I should say to them." Here we see how Unka refuses to assimilate to this new culture, instead demanding that the natives adapt to her ways.
The next major theme we see in these novels is the power of femininity. Even though Murrieta is the main character in Ridge's novel, it is the women in this book who challenge the confines and expectation of their gender. The women in this novel journey with the men and even dress as men to protect themselves in their travels. When Joaquin travels, he has no issue with the women accompanying them, as he takes not only his men, but also the 3 bright-eyed girls who, mounted on very elegant chargers, appeared as charming a trio of handsome cavaliers as ever, delighted the visions of romantic damsels. These women understood their femininity and their beauty in relation to the idea of womanhood. While they ride with the men, there is no gender hierarchy, as they are respected, understood, and free to travel with the men. In The Female American, we see the power of femininity and how Unka views herself and the power she believes she has. We see many instances of this in the novel when she first states, "I would never marry any man who could not use a bow and arrow as well as I could," revealing she believes in her equal power and that she would not marry a man who is not her equal. This also parallels later in the novel when she first starts to teach the native people about her religion. At first they would like to make her her queen, which she denies, saying, "I thank you for your kind offer, but I will not be your queen, therefore you may choose whom you please." Unka decided on her own that she would not marry the king and have his children, but instead teach and be able to come and go as she pleases, proving the strength of her femininity.
The last shared theme we would like to discuss is the idea of narratives ended early. Even though we see the power these characters have over themselves and others, both characters' narratives come to an early end. For Murrieta, his narrative ends when he is run down and shot, but he still maintains his power by saying, "Don't shoot anymore, the work is done." Murrieta's narrative ended with his head being cut off, his narrative being cut short, never again being able to have control over his own life. For Unka, this comes in the form of marriage, where her narrative switches from being about I to we. Her dialogue shifts from her thoughts and beliefs to being centered around her husband. Notice the use of plural pronouns in this passage. We were both very glad to hear that our father and mother were all well, and our sisters. In this moment, Anka gives up her authority over herself and thinks of herself in association with her husband, which is a great shift from her views on marriage earlier in the novel, showing how narratives can be cut short with no warning.
The life and adventures of Joaquin Murrieta and the female American were written at different times in history, but both share similar themes about what it means to be a minority in America.